Well, it is another Pleasant Valley Sunday. Thank you to the Monkeys for that little bit. Love the Monkeys, and I think very possibly my next guest, who you hear quite often, almost every day with me now, Mike Myers would agree with me. Aren't the Monkeys one of the best bands ever?
Yeah, I would say next to the Beatles, the Monkees number one. Yeah.
And so this Pleasant Valley Sunday, I felt it was kind of fitting Sunday, and also it's sort of a story of sameness, right? So here we are again in quarantine again. Just another Pleasant Valley Sunday. What can I tell you?
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
So what's up? I know that you have been doing an experiment with social media, and I thought you should share that with us today.
Well, it started off with a post: farmers market to open Monday! Exclamation point! Hooray! Exclamation point! Everyone, please be optimistic. Please be wise and don't live in fear. Oh boy. That got ugly.
Well, explain it to us, because I know that it really affected you and made you take a drastic move.
Well, yeah, I guess it was kind of drastic. Some of the comments that were made were just absolute. It was kind of sort of balanced, but some of them were just really nasty. Just personal attacks but that's okay. And then let me follow that up with this right here, because I had a brother in Christ.
Okay.
Tell me that I was basically a pot stirrer. Now I used to smoke pot, but I don't anymore.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have said that.
Oh, hey, you know what? That was who you are. No regrets, right, Michael?
Yeah. Well, so here's the timeline. At 8:45 April 24th, farmers market open Monday. Hooray! Everyone, please be optimistic, be wise, and don't live in fear. Well, then yesterday at 6:28 in the mañana.
Mm-hmm.
Today I will start practicing social media distancing until the hatred begins to level off. It's toxic in here. Trump 2020.
Wow.
That was probably a little bit of a pot stirrer.
That one I had seen, and that one had a few comments, but I guess I missed the original post. But here's the thing, and you were kind of proving it, that they don't want to, some people just don't want to hear we can get out and do things. They just want to say, that's not safe, we have to stay inside. No, we have to go out and do things too.
Well, and the thing that was interesting is that there was a reference made to me being a pot stirrer, but the initial pot was actually one of, wasn't stirring. I was trying to be optimistic, be wise, and it just got ugly. And that's why I posted the other one and went, I can't do this. I just need to get away from this for a while. And yeah, throw in the Trump 2020 in there. Maybe, yeah, I suppose a little. But it was interesting to not look at any, this morning was the first time I looked at any posts. You know that. Well, you don't know that unless I...
But you went 24 hours. And so if people really feel like, well, I think you can teach people a lesson here. Because if they really feel they do have to distance themselves from this whole thing, the platforms, how can they do it for even 24 hours? How did you do it? Did you get a little anxious not looking at social media, or were you calm about it?
It would be... Did I get anxious? I was getting anxious, and I wasn't liking... I don't like anxiety. I mean, and here, if there's some way that I can do something that will help eliminate some of that anxiousness and not have to take, not have to get drunk or take, I don't know, Xanax. Yeah, that's the one. And it worked, and it was really pretty nice.
Well, let me ask you, do you do crosswords? Do you do anything word gamey to get your mind off when you're anxious?
No, I do projects. Now today I'm going to pick back up on putting a ceiling fan in our living room, the only room in the house that doesn't have a fan. And so I'm looking forward to that. And I will probably take another day away from social media.
Well, isn't this the best day to do it? Sunday, you could just kind of relax and not worry about who's commenting on what, and just as you like to say, be with the Lord a little more on His day, on Sunday.
Well, and to me, every day, really, if every day, if every day is His day in my temple, in my heart, I'm gonna. I can tell you, this has been really fascinating.
Mm.
It's been very just revealing of how. I don't know if you. I guess if you're gonna be around a lot of people with just a lot of hatred and not a whole lot of hope and love and faith. But I don't want to, hide. I mean, God says, don't. I'm not going to take you out of the world. I'm going to believe you in the world, but don't be of the world. That's quite a statement.
Mm. Well, I feel like there was one person of the world, wasn't that Christ, who was of the whole world?
Yeah, he was. He was in it, and yet, I don't know it. It's starting to hurt my head already.
Okay.
Anxious. I need a drink.
Hey, we haven't talked about this yet, but you do. We all do, right? But you do a live stream on 24 hours, and if people are interested in what music you're playing there, how can they find it?
How can they find the music
or your live stream of music that goes on every day?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Alex. What's the easiest way to? Well, go to TuneIn.
Okay.
And actually, I think I might have a different. Well, go to TuneIn and just put in the search MUK Muck, and there's a story behind that. And then no space, and then the word radio, Muck Radio, and it'll pop up. And right now you'll be hearing a gentleman from Australia. His name is Tom French, who is just a hoot. He's a youth pastor, and that's really where my heart is with kids. And I'm just a big one.
Well, you had this great story a couple of days ago about these kids that threw away their drugs and were getting clean. And I mean, are you going to bring them on the radio on your pod?
Well, I had this young man on before, and he had this epiphany and was coming back to Jesus. And because this young man used to come to youth group, and he was probably 12 or 13, and I had him on a show. And the next day he was back, it was just like, hey, whatever, and yeah, that was today or yesterday. Today is today, and I'm back doing my same old crap. Which reminds me, if you're somebody who claims to be a follower and lover of Jesus, something should change.
You mean he's gone back to it? Wait, what exactly? Or are you going back?
I'm sorry. Yeah, he went right back to the same old
drug use.
The same old stuff again after I allowed him to come on thinking, hey, this is pretty cool. He's done with this stuff, and right on, God got a hold on him, which reminds me of a song, and he's got this new life going, and it's like, yeah. The story of the four soils is just a powerful story about, how do we receive the truth? Does it sink down deep, get some deep roots, or is it like, oh, this is great, I love Jesus, Jesus loves me, I have a good new life, and then it's gone because the things of the world choke it out.
Well, let me ask you, did you find out from him personally that he got back on it, or?
No, that's a good question. I don't recall that for sure.
Okay.
But I do know that he did go right back to the same stuff, which, who am I? My goodness gracious, I could tell you things that God knows that I don't need to tell you because I just reminded me of the fact that I'm a hypocrite.
And that's what Christ pointed out, right? Like, if you cast the stone, have you not sinned as well? Something to that line.
Yeah, the lady they caught in adultery. I mean, man, he turned that right around. And then the speck in the log. I mean, you can't. I had a pastor friend of mine say something about stir the pot much. Now, I love this guy dearly. But this is a guy who, because of his calling, can't really be upfront about everything that he he feels about, his opinion on things.
Sure.
He's got to stay publicly neutral.
Mm.
And in fact, I have the verse pulled up here. Blessed are the peacemakers. I was going to post, so much for blessed are the peacemakers, because I want to be a peacemaker.
Mm-hmm.
I really do, and that's why the hope thing. So I just printed off, I don't know how many pages of all of this stuff that these people were saying. I don't want it. My first thought was, you know what? They posted it publicly. They flat out said, somebody said, well, oh, did I hurt your feelings? Did you delete my post? I didn't delete anybody's post. So right there, the accusations, there they are. And I wasn't even there.
It is amazing, though. Some people I know delete comments if they disagree with the person. It's like, why would you do that? Just that's censoring the page too much.
Well, and I have a friend of mine who flat out said, Mike, don't, because I said, you know what, I think I'll delete this after 15 minutes or something, because it just got uglier and uglier.
I know.
And this buddy of mine said, don't delete it, leave it out there so people, you know what, if I put something out there publicly that was so nasty, and I turn around later and it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. Boy, did I take that thing out of context. That would be a very humbling life lesson.
Mike, let's talk about this for a minute. So this is where the podcast can come in, right? So you had actually people on your pod, like in the chat section, saying, Mike, don't take it down. You had that support as well, didn't you?
Yes.
So that's important to say, that these podcasts are online, and whatever you want to say about the internet, these things are impacting people's lives, and that's why they comment to us and say, hey, here's what we think of what you're doing. It's kind of interesting to think of it that way.
Yeah, and there's a buddy of mine that I met through podcasting out on the East Coast who is just a neat guy, and he's kind of sort of in the same boat of, he'll kind of jump in once in a while to social media, but we have some fantastic conversations, late night, 1-2 hour conversations, and those are the kind of relationships I have. So I just love them. But to be in this constant turmoil with somebody who you disagree with, it's not worth it. I'm commanded to love them, and so the best thing for me to do sometimes is I just need to get back. They're a little toxic for me, and maybe I am for them. And take some time to be alone with Christ and get refilled with love.
What it just is interesting, isn't it, that someone from the East Coast could open up their sort of life to talk to you, and yet people in your own town are bashing you. Like, that says a lot about the community, right?
Yeah, yesterday I was out edging my sidewalk, and this young man came by and told me actually his name's Garrett.
Oh, look at that.
And turns out that he was a young guy. He used to come to youth group. And a friend of his, and one of the kids that came to youth group, whom I'm going to reconnect with, how do I put this? Weird. The first thing that Garrett said was, well, we're definitely not on the same side of the, we have different political views. I said, that's fine. I talked to this gal the other day, and I said, man, if Trump ever comes between you and I picture me giving her a COVID-safe hug, and Trump in the middle, it's like, ew, I don't want that to ever happen. I'm not married to Trump. He's not my idol. He says things I wish he wouldn't say, but the guy at least says them, and he's...
Right. No, I hear what you're saying. And apparently there was some project earlier in the week that he was referencing about the disinfectant. But then, of course, I see 30 phone calls came into the city's health control because they were trying to put disinfectant in their body. So I just don't like that either.
Well, I mean, maybe if they were to read the bottle, somebody had said that's why they put the label on the McDonald's coffee. I mean, you can't be somebody else's brain. You can't.
Right.
And then for that to be blamed on other people.
Well, it's just absurd, though, that 30 people actually thought that that's what he was talking about. That is
And did they?
Um, what did they?
Do we know for a fact that 30 people did that?
Yeah, 30. They recorded 30 phone calls in an 18-hour period
Who
post
did?
disinfect. The New York City Health Control.
Huh. Wow, I'd love to see that.
I'm gonna send you the NPR article. See, I don't.
NPR?
NPR actually reported that.
Okay,
So,
that's a great news source.
are you being sarcastic or?
Yeah, I am. I'm sorry.
Huh.
I listen to NPR when I drive the kids back and forth, and you talk about one-sided.
But I think that's an important story to talk about because it's so stupid. But I do feel like I have to say on this podcast, hey, if you like Trump, don't go by swallowing disinfectant. I mean, I shouldn't have to say that, but there are people out there that would apparently hear that and just go, buck wild with Lysol. It's weird.
But if you were to say to me,
Mm-hmm.
Mike, Trump said this, don't do that. You know what I would think about you, Alex?
You would think, what would you think?
I would think you're an arrogant jerk.
Okay.
I'm just being honest. Really, so you're going to tell me, it's like, hey, this guy was buying, I'm not trying to be nasty, but the other day I was at the hardware store and a guy was buying a rake. And I said, it looks like you're going to do some raking. And I said, no, wait a minute, you're going to change the oil in your car. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be nasty, but that is the nasty side of me that I don't like. What I just pulled on you, I don't like that in me. I am really sorry. I owe you an apology.
No, I get what you're saying, though. That's why I don't really talk about it, because I also think of the idea that we have to ignore those comments and not even bring it up, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Because the more...
the point that what you just helped me understand is, Mike, don't get so freaked out. Don't get so pulled into all of this stuff. And I think the best thing for me is going to be to just start back, just being a little more careful on social media. Yeah, am I a pot stirrer? Yeah, and I could put back on there, yep, not only the guy's name is Sean, I know him well. Not real well. Sean, I am a pot stirrer. I used to smoke pot, but, that would just be, I don't know.
Well, I know that...
I love you, man. I'm glad you said what you said, because it brought out a part of me that I just need to stifle it. I need to control my tongue and my thoughts.
Well, that's so. But in general, you would feel that someone telling people not to listen to the president would be quote unquote arrogant. Like, is that how you would think of them?
No, I would say listen to the president and realize that actually many people have said, this guy he hooked you. He threw this out there, and in fact, this post, I was thinking about, it's kind of like saying, preach it to a preacher. It's like throwing him a piece of meat. I mean, you're just going to preach all the more. They're just going to drive home the point all the more because you're encouraging them. And what Trump does, he really plays this up weird. I mean, he's no idiot. He's a Trump. And I think he does things just to get people to go over there, and then he comes back over here and he does his thing.
Right.
And in the meantime, he's gotten some neat stuff done, and these people are still over there, ripping each other apart.
Well, how about this? I've always thought that when Trump says something, right, it's kind of off the top of his head. And but then 2 days later, something verifies it. Like somehow, okay, we all know Obama didn't tap the tower, Trump Tower. But we do know they did surveil on Carter Page and people within the Trump campaign. So that, what he said there, ended up being somehow true because the Obama administration did wiretap his campaign. There's no doubt about it. And so no one went back and said, you know what, Trump was right on that. They just ignored the fact that he was right on it.
There's a post I'm looking at right here. This guy says the hate is not equal right now. Right now is worse than when Obama was in office. It's not even close. The thing that I'm seeing, Alex, and I've said this for a while, when Obama was in office, the Republicans were so out to get the birther thing.
Mm-hmm. No,
and now it's just, the pendulum has gone the other way, and it's like, I just need to not get sucked into this, but I need to know what's going on. We had a talk last night, you and I did, about some stuff going on overseas. Those are important things that are happening in this world.
For those who don't know,
news anymore.
I'm probably going to do a little later about the topics I haven't covered yet, but those who don't know, there's a protest in Tel Aviv. And also those who don't know, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, has actually divided up roles of the government with Benny Gantz, who was his opponent. And if I have you here for a second, I'll just tell you what's going to happen here. So for 36 months, Netanyahu will continue as prime minister, while Gantz is sworn in as defense minister. I've never seen an election work like that. This is the most fascinating thing I've ever read, actually, about government anywhere. Then a year and a half from now, Gantz is going to take over the reins. So it's like they're splitting the government. I've never seen that before.
And there's so many things that I haven't seen because I've never been that involved in the first place. Which is not, I mean, I got one friend who says he doesn't look at the news, he doesn't listen to the news, he doesn't do anything with the news, and I'm like, well, you can't just live your life with your head stuck in the sand. You got to know what's going on.
Right.
But like you and I have been talking about, what is a reliable news source that's not going to be, I checked out one of them that somebody suggested the other day, and it's like, man, this sucker is, can you just give me the news without the bias?
Right. No, exactly. Or just give us news. Yeah. So, because a lot of these things have become opinion and not like straight news, right? So this is the problem. And it's, I'm glad that you brought this up because my next guest is waiting in the wings. He's going to be with me in a minute. He wrote about the interesting White House stories that no one really has heard about. And Radio Hope, which you can listen to at 9 a.m. Eastern, by the way. He's a former journalist, so he's going to tell me about the fake news, what he thinks of it all, as well later in the interview. So definitely want to stay tuned. And we're going to jump over to you as well. What do you got on the pod today?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. Perfect timing, because that's what I was thinking about this morning. Miles McKee from Spain, originally from Dublin, Ireland, will be. He's going to be preaching. I miss hearing a good live word from God's word. I just I need that.
Well, you know, and he's in one of the hardest hit areas right now. Spain's still getting cases, and I'm sure his wisdom is going to be very important right now.
$3,000 fine if you left your house. That's what he said, and I'm like, wow, gee whiz. So anyway, hey, thanks for having me.
You got it.
I love this, what we're doing. I love the fact that you and I are continuing this.
And for those who don't know, we've actually been seeing each other via the screen. So we've got a little double connection here. So there you go.
Oh, I lost your face.
You did. Do you get me now?
Okay.
All right, anyway.
Oh, there you are.
So as I was saying, we're doing video chat as well during this, so we're all in sync. And if you noticed before, we were kind of talking over each other, and now we can see each other. So that's even better.
Reminds me of a song. Am I in sync? And then the song gets all out of whack. It's hilarious.
All right. Well, we will tune into what you got going on at 9 a.m. and whatever wacky music you might actually play in that hour today.
Well, no, it'll all be Miles. Well, no, never mind.
Mike is someone who you never know what's going to happen on the pod because he free flows it, which I love about it. So it's good.
I don't know. All right.
Hey,
sir.
Talk to you tomorrow.
All right.
Bye. All right, and so as we continue here, I'm going to have my Hal Marcovitz on in just a minute. But did you hear the good news out of Albany yesterday?
On the eligibility, because we had a limited capacity to test. As you increase the capacity to test, you can increase the eligibility. And first responders, healthcare workers, and essential employees. Why? Because these people have been carrying the load, and they have been subjected to the public all during this crisis, and because they're public-facing, right? These are the people who you interact with. You get on a bus, this is the bus driver. You get in a subway car, this is the subway conductor. You are interacting with government. These are the people who you're interacting with. If they're infected, they could possibly spread it to a large number of people. So we're dramatically increasing the capacity with these groups. What are first responders? Firefighters, paramedics, EMTs, police officers, state, local, county, sheriffs, etc. Also, correction parole officers, probation officers, people who are in the prisons. They can now go to the increased number of collection sites in the state. They're eligible to get a test.
That is huge. So essential workers actually getting the testing now, expanding as Governor Cuomo expands the testing and the sites to go to, by the way. He mentions later on. I would just say go to the Governor Cuomo's website and figure out where you can get a test. And again, a huge thank you to our essential workers, right? I mean, our health care workers, healthcare workers and our police officers that respond to crisis in this time, our EMTs that respond to crisis, that respond to calls, all of them, and the MTA, and to know that they're all going to be tested now, little by little, should actually help us bring relief, even more relief, to this city. So that gets ramped up. And now, without further ado, Hal Marcovitz, he's an investigative journalist, or was, and he ended up writing this book about the White House. And Hal Marcovitz, how did you use your journalistic instincts to write a book of the most interesting stories that you've found in the White House? Good morning.
Well, I had covered politics in where I live in Pennsylvania for over 30 years. And, I always had kind of a fascination with it. And I kind of thought up this funny story about, a ordinary house painter who gets hired by the First Lady to paint the White House. And once he shows up there and gets involved with all the shenanigans and weird stuff that goes on in the White House. So that's kind of how the book came out of it. But it was my interest in politics. And, the weird things politicians do. That kind of led me to start researching the White House.
Well, let me first ask you this, because I know you've had a lot of different experiences, but I got to ask about the White House dog. Any crazy White House dog experiences that you might have found that our listeners would enjoy hearing?
Well, there was two kind of dogs of note who lived in the White House, although many pets were in the White House. But the two funny stories that I came across about the White House dogs was the first one involved the dog named Millie, who was owned by George and Barbara Bush. And if you go online and you look for pictures of Millie the dog, you'll see this, just heartwarming pictures of the Bushes strolling around the White House grounds, and Millie is kind of trotting after them, and it's just, just terrific, kind of really sweet stuff. But as I looked into this further, I found out that George H.W. Bush, had a weird kind of habit that he did with Millie. That Millie, when the president went to take a shower, Millie often jumped in with him. So George and Millie took showers together in the White House.
Right, and that is pretty funny. And I know that, of course, George W. was in the White House and he had his own pup. But wow, and how old was George at the time during his father's presidency?
Oh, well, I guess that would have been back in the 90s. So maybe George W. Was probably in his 30s by then, I would imagine.
And, of course, they had their own pet. Now, the interesting thing is, this president doesn't have a dog, and people have actually noticed that, right?
You mean President Trump?
Yeah, President Trump has not had any pet in the White House yet.
No, he doesn't.
So that's kind of been an interesting thing. Now, I'm reading this press byline that you've got, and I've got to ask you, with all the press conferences that we're seeing every day, there was one bizarre one with Dwight Eisenhower and his bowels. What is going on there?
Well, President Eisenhower suffered a heart attack and lived through it. He recovered. And his doctors called a press conference to brief the nation on the health of the president. And it was during that press conference when the doctors were reassuring the country that the president was okay, that they disclosed that he had successfully moved his bowels. That deeply troubled President Eisenhower.
Well, when you think about it, I mean, I guess for such a huge name in our military, right, in the World War, to know that his bowels work just showed us. It just is interesting that, this big general, and that was what the doctors were focused on, right?
I guess. Well, it showed he was healthy, so.
Well, right, exactly. So that's interesting. Now, when you started to go through it, what other bizarre stories that I know you're dying to talk about have come your way?
Oh, it's almost endless. One of my favorite stories that I came across, and it's absolutely made me laugh out loud, was a story involving Elvis Presley back in 1970, I believe. Elvis Presley was something of a police buff. He collected badges and belt buckles, that sort of thing, from police departments. I guess he had a hobby. He had his eye on a badge from the Drug Enforcement Administration. He wanted a DEA badge. So he asked around, and he found out the only way he could get a DEA badge is to be deputized as a DEA agent, and of course that means to join the DEA. Well, Elvis wasn't going to do that. So he thought up this plan. He called his guys together, down at the mansion in Graceland, and he told them, we're going to fly up to Washington today. We're going to drive right to the White House, and President Nixon is going to swear me in as a DEA agent. So everybody was gung-ho. So they piled into a car, and they drove up to the airport, and they took a plane up to Washington, and they hired a car, and they went right up to the White House gate. Elvis gets out. He's got on this velour jumpsuit, that Elvis was prone to wearing. And he goes up to the guard at the gate, and he tells him what he's there for, to get sworn in by President Nixon into the DEA. So the guard calls into the White House and tells them what's going on. They had no idea Elvis was coming that day. So this story shoots around the White House like crazy. What do we do about this? Elvis is at the door. What should we do? So they finally decide to get him some time with the president and swear him in as a DEA agent, give him the badge. So they find him a little time, sort of like at the end of the lunch hour, when the president would shake hands with visiting dignitaries. And they usher Elvis into the Oval Office, and they get a picture taken, and it's my understanding that photo of Elvis and Nixon shaking hands is one of the top-selling souvenirs at the Nixon Library. So Nixon swears in Elvis, and everybody's having a good time, and Elvis wants to show his appreciation to the president, and he has brought a gift with him to give to the president, and it turns out to be a gun.
Oh.
Elvis had actually brought a gun into the White House and got it into the Oval Office. And I'm sure the Secret Service swallowed pretty hard. And I guess they weren't checking them all too quickly or too thoroughly as they would today. But everything went fine, and Nixon accepted the gun. And the funny postscript to this whole story is after Elvis leaves with his badge, and Nixon turns to his aides, and he tells them that he really didn't know who that guy was, that he knew he was some kind of an entertainer, and that his daughters listened to his music, but who was that, the king of rock and roll?
Well, Nixon always kind of had a colder front to him, so that doesn't surprise me. Like, I don't know, he didn't seem to be culturally in tune, right, Hal?
I guess he was kind of out of touch with a lot of things.
Well, yeah. Well, it's funny you mentioned Elvis, because I literally have a lamp right next to me with the Blue Sage shoes and an Elvis Presley signed, fake record. But it's just funny you mentioned him, because he's literally, I'm staring at him right here in my room. So there you go.
Does he have his DEA badge on?
I'm looking at the outline of him on the silhouette. I can't find that, but I'll keep looking. Hey, any other entertainers? Sinatra was big, and I know also he found his way into the White House. Any stories of Sinatra, now that we're talking a little music here?
I didn't run across anything about Sinatra. I know during the Ford administration, Gerald Ford, his daughters, Susan and Steve, were big music fans, and they saw this as the opportunity to get to know a lot of celebrities. A couple years they were in the White House, and they had, parties in the White House, and they would invite all sorts of celebrities, singers in, Peter Frampton, I think, the Beach Boys,
Sure.
Ravi Shankar, who was the sitar player, George Harrison, I think. So all those, celebrities, were featured in the White House during the Ford years. But the really funny one actually occurred right after Ford left, and that's when Jimmy Carter was in the White House.
Right.
And they invited Willie Nelson over. Huh. And Willie came to the White House, and as the story goes, he found his way up to the roof where he smoked a joint.
That would be Willie Nelson, right? That would be Willie. I've got to ask you about Ford, though. I mean, the guy was known for falling all over the place. So in your research on Ford, any funny falling stories that maybe the public didn't know? I feel like they knew every time he fell, though, right?
I didn't. I think his falls were pretty well documented, and I think everybody kind of saw everything they needed to know about Gerald Ford tripping over his own 2 feet.
Would you agree?
I didn't come across any kind of secret falling stories.
Well, would you agree? I mean, now that we're on it and you've been following this, I mean, they say Chevy Chase really changed his presidency because of the way he impersonated him on SNL. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not, but that was kind of the notion back then.
Well, I am kind of old enough to remember that myself, and it was a pretty funny gag, a pretty funny bit that he did, and perhaps he made Ford into something of a laughing stock.
All right, so I'm looking at all the other stuff that you've covered in this book called "The Painting the White House." First of all, why that title, "Painting the White House"? Oh, because of the painter.
Well, again,
correct. Yep, I got you on that. And so, go ahead.
The book is a novel, and it is kind of based on these weird things that go on in the White House. But it is a novel. It's a work of fiction, and it's the story of the house painter who shows up to paint the White House and puts down his drop cloths and his ladders and gets his rollers out and gets all ready to paint the White House, and then finds himself involved in all these weird intrigues and stories and back and forth dramas that go on in the White House. But there is, if you are really into this, there is a lot of information in there on how to pick colors and the effects of 2 coats of interior flat latex and all sorts of good stuff that painters would only know about.
Okay, so what's going on through this painter's mind when the president asks members of Congress to eat at the White House? What's going on through his mind when he sees the president asking members of Congress to eat with him?
Well, that story actually goes back to Jimmy Carter, who charged members of Congress to, when he would invite them over for working breakfast or working lunches, he charged them $4.75 per meal to eat in the White House with him. All the other presidents before, and I believe since, have, let the members of Congress eat for free. But Carter, was a bit of a fuss budget, and he charged them each $4.75 for their meals in the White House.
Okay, so who were the Congress people back then? Like, obviously, this generation knows Pelosi and all that. Who were the high prominent Congress people that were being charged for this?
Oh, boy, I guess you go back to the Carter administration. You had guys like Tip O'Neill and, I guess, John Hines from Pennsylvania, I remember, was in the Senate then. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House. Boy, you're asking me to really...
Well, I guess because some of these guys are still there.
Cobwebs out of my brain.
Cummings was probably there. Of course, he passed away now, but Elijah Cummings probably was there. I think Biden had to be around that time too, right? Joe Biden?
That might have been a little before Joe's time. I think he got in a little later than the Carter administration.
But nonetheless, I'm sure whoever was in there couldn't believe the bill that they were getting just to eat with the president. That is different. But this administration, right? I mean, there's so many different, what do you say, quirks and weird things that happen and whatnot. What is so unusual about this Trump administration that that your painter has been seeing?
The kind of the weird thing that I found out about the Trump White House, and believe me, there's a lot of weirdness up there, I guess, but the president and the First Lady, Melania Trump, do not share a bedroom. And actually, that's not unusual. A lot of presidents and First Ladies decide to have their own rooms. And I suppose there's good reason for that, because the president, he's up all night on the phone, and he's talking to leaders of other countries and other time zones, and I guess the First Lady just wants to get to bed. This case, though, is slightly different. The living quarters at the White House are on the second floor. There's actually something of an apartment up there, and that's where the president and his family live. And the first floor, of course, is all the diplomatic and the cultural centers and all that, and the working offices. That's all on the first floor. The president lives on the second floor. But there's actually also a third floor with some living quarters up there. And it was during the Obama administration that Michelle Obama's mother lived on the third floor of the White House, president's mother-in-law.
Right.
So the Obamas move out, and the Trumps move in. And Melania Trump discovers these rooms up there on the third floor, and that's where she lives. So the Trumps not only do not share a bedroom in the White House, they don't even share the same floor in the White House.
Whew. That's pretty incredible. No, that is mind blowing. Of course, sometimes you wonder because she sometimes looks a little miserable next to him. I mean, it's very interesting, their dynamic. And would you say then that sleeping on separate floors doesn't help their dynamic, or does it help them during this whole crazy presidency we're in?
Well, I can't see that it does help. She's been pretty absent through this whole national emergency we have, so maybe she's just happy hanging out on the third floor.
Possibly. Now, I've got to ask then, did this administration inspire you to write this, or when did you actually start writing the book?
No, I wrote this pretty much before the Trumps were in there, because believe me, there's no shortage of goofiness in the White House. The Trumps did not.
Oh, of course not. It's been wild.
It goes all the way back to even before the White House was built. So.
Well, talk about that, because I know you've had something about the construction of the White House. What weirdness just with the construction itself did you want to talk about? There's some Betsy Donahue. What do you have to say about that as well? I know you mentioned it in your book.
Okay. The White House, and we're going back to now the 1790s or whatever. The White House was designed by an architect named James Hoban. And Hoban actually won a competition to design the White House. He was awarded the contract, and just as a kind of a footnote there, he actually beat out Thomas Jefferson for the job. Jefferson had submitted his own plans, but the committee picked Hoban's design, and that's what they went with. So Hoban is designed the White House, and he's going to oversee the construction. And he decides the best way to do this is actually to live on the grounds, the construction grounds over there on Pennsylvania Avenue. So he has a cabin built for himself on the construction grounds, and he moves in. So he's overseeing the construction 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At some point, Hoban decides that it's far enough along, I don't have to live here anymore, and he moves out of the cabin. And he leases the cabin to a carpenter named Donahue and his wife, Betsy. So the Donahues move in. And it was shortly after the Donahues were living in the cabin that it was discovered that Betsy Donahue was running a brothel out of the cabin.
Oh, my.
So I guess the Donahues were kicked out, but the first official or unofficial use of the White House grounds was as a brothel.
Oh, my goodness.
Very good marketing
I mean, talk about history repeating itself a little bit. It seems kind of crazy what happened in the Clinton years, too, knowing this fact now. I mean, how many people know this?
Well, shades of things to come.
Yeah, really. What an omen, or what a foreshadow, I guess you'd say. Okay, so I want to ask about any interesting stories. You know, the White House did burn. Didn't it burn at one point? I remember the Madisons were trying to get everything out of the White House. I don't know if you have any stories on that, but didn't it burn down at one point?
Yes, actually, it was President Madison was in the White House during the War of 1812, and as history knows, as we know from history, the British invaded Washington, D.C., and the city was evacuated, and the president and his family evacuated the White House. So the British show up, and it's about 150 sailors, British sailors,
Oh my God.
break into the White House. And they're walking around, and some of the sailors find the president's bedroom. And before they set fire to the White House and burned it down, they stole his underwear. These sailors,
Oh my.
The British Navy. And I imagine, these voyages across the ocean in those days took a few months, so it was probably hard to come by clean underwear. So that's what they wanted to take with them before they burned down the White House.
Oh my God. And oh my goodness. So the what is it, Dolly Madison? Her trying to save the art isn't the only thing that happened during that time. The president's underwear was stolen. So that is
That's right. That's what goes down in history.
That is crazy. All right, let's talk about. And by the way, the rebuilding of it, they got back into normal. And so, who was the next one to have it after Madison? I'm trying to think of my history here. To get back in after that, because did the next president have a fully White House, or do they have to keep reconstructing it, or keep fixing it after the burn?
No, they rebuilt the White House, and actually they rebuilt it again in the 1950s. And this is kind of a weird story. It was President Truman was in then, and I believe it was Bess Truman, the president's daughter, had a piano up there on the second floor, and she was playing this piano one day, and a leg of the piano broke through the floor.
What?
So, yeah, right. I got this grand piano, and I got a heavy instrument, and it broke through the floor. So the leg and the whole thing didn't come crashing down. It wasn't that catastrophic. So they bring in the engineers, and they look the place over, and they decide, it's about to fall apart. It's this old 200 or so year old building by now, 150-year-old building, and it's pretty much a mess. So they have decided to rebuild the White House, and what they're going to do is they're going to leave the interior walls up, and they're going to they're going to leave the exterior walls up, and they're going to gut the interior and completely rebuild the interior rooms. So the Trumans move out, of course, while this work is going on. But to do the demolition on the inside of the White House, they need to bring a bulldozer in to knock things down and dig the new basement and that sort of thing. So the engineers want to cut a hole in the exterior wall of the White House so they can drive the bulldozer in. So they tell Truman about this, and he says, absolutely not. You're not going to cut a hole in the wall of the White House. So to get the bulldozer into the White House, they took it apart piece by piece. They carried it in through the front door, and then they reassembled it inside the White House.
Including the ball that knocks everything out. Including that heavy ball. Oh, my goodness.
To get in there.
That's crazy.
I guess like an erector said, right?
Well, and so that's kind of, I guess, the way it's become, because it's a beautiful place today. Like, you look at the exterior, I guess it's become, just fixed along the way. Any other renovations that we may not have known about after the 50s, or is that the last time?
Well, there was a kind of a funny story involving Bill Clinton shortly after he got, he got into the White House. Clinton is walking down the hallway with his aides, and they're talking about whatever presidents talk about to their aides. And Clinton sees there's a guy working on the air conditioning. Okay.
Okay.
So he stops and he talks to the guy, and he spends the next half hour helping him fix the air conditioner in the White House, passing him tools and that sort of thing, and really kind of getting his hands dirty. So whatever the free world was doing at that moment had to wait for about a half hour while Clinton helped to fix the White House air conditioner.
What knowledge did he have to do that? I guess he just was okay working around the house. I mean, that's different.
I guess he was just a handy guy. I mean, I couldn't fix my air conditioner, so I guess that's why he got to be president, and the rest of us didn't. He was good at that kind of thing.
That's unique. Okay, so in the Obama years, so the mother-in-law was there. That's got to be a story in and of itself. I mean, the Obama mother-in-law living there. Did anybody know that? I mean, was that well documented? I didn't really know of that.
Oh no, it was known. Michelle Obama's mother was living on the third floor. I will tell you that the Obamas, as far as I could tell, were probably one of the most boring families to have lived in the White House. I found I found no funny stories about them. Okay. As hard as I looked, the president was like one of these draft beer guys, and he liked to make his own beer. Little stuff like that. But really? Oh, that's great.
Well, what about Biden? I mean, was there any interesting stories on Biden as a VP? Because, I mean, he was kind of documented as sort of this interesting, funny guy that was the VP. And, I mean, anything on him that you had seen or any vice presidential stories as well?
Well, he didn't live in the White House, so the vice president has his own place out.
Oh, that's right.
I believe it's on the grounds of the Naval Observatory. And even then, I understood Biden. He would go home to Delaware, which was kind of just a short train ride away. So he didn't spend that much time down there.
Interesting. Well, I got to ask about this because I literally live next to Coolidge Avenue here in Queens. Calvin Coolidge talked with raccoons. What in the world? Tell me about that.
Yeah, he adopted, so to speak, a pet raccoon that found its way onto the White House grounds, and he and the raccoon became good buddies. And he would let the raccoon into the White House during the day, and the raccoon would scurry around the hallways. And at night, the raccoon had a little house that Coolidge had built for it on the grounds, so it did sleep in its own house, presumably next to the White House dumpster, I imagine. But the aides would follow Coolidge around the grounds, and he would be chatting with the raccoon as they kind of strolled around, and I guess he was kind of bouncing ideas off the raccoon.
My!
Should we fund the Food and Drug Administration, or let it run out of money?
Well, he was. All right, now I've got to ask you this because these insane stories continue in this book called Painting the White House, a novel by Hal Marcovitz. And you are a journalist, and so you use this journalistic instinct to investigate all this. I've got to ask you about Hoover because he, of course, was known as fishing while the economy went to crap during the Depression. So any other stories about him that you might want to share with us?
There's this very, very weird story about Herbert Hoover and the First Lady, who was Lou Henry Hoover. The Hoovers did not want to encounter members of the domestic staff, the White House domestic staff, and we're talking about the housekeepers, the butlers, the cooks, those folks who actually actually work in the White House. The Hoovers did not want to encounter them as they strolled around the hallways or whatever. So the Hoovers had all the domestic workers issued little bells that they were to carry around with them. And if you were one of these workers and you saw either the president or the first lady in the hallway or whatever, you were to ring the bell. You ring your little bell, and that was a signal to all the other domestic workers to hide. So they would see the Hoovers, and the bell would go off, and the domestic workers would run into the closets or hide behind doors or whatever until the Hoovers, passed through that part of the building. So this kind of has a funny postscript to itself. Years later, the Clintons are in the White House. Hillary Clinton is the first lady, and she's walking down the hallway, and she sees a couple of the housekeepers dart across the hallway and duck into a closet. So she goes up to the closet, and she opens the door, and she asks them what they're doing in there. And they told her that they were under orders to hide whenever they see a member of the president's family. And Hillary kind of looks at them and says, well, you don't have to do that. Please don't do that. So it's kind of strange that this little tradition that started with the Hoovers apparently did not end until 40 or 50 years later when the Clintons showed up.
My goodness. Holy crud. That's kind of like, I don't know, that's kind of like the real life comparison, right? So in the 30s, the economy kind of disappeared on us, and 50 years later, Clinton has a surplus, the housekeepers make an appearance. Kind of an interesting connection there.
I guess you could look at it that way.
All right.
The economy disappeared, and so did the housekeepers.
Yep. Hey, JFK, I mean, unfortunately he got assassinated, but I heard, and maybe you can dispel some of this stuff, I heard he had crazy times in the White House as president, but were they all true? What truth do you know about the Kennedy household during the White House years?
Oh, well, I guess, the stories are myriad, and, there was those old long told stories about the president with Marilyn Monroe, and all I can say is, hey, is that really unusual or whatever? Back in the 1800s, President Taft was married in the White House, and he married a woman who was much younger. It was her name was Frances Folsom. I'm sorry, it wasn't Taft. It was Grover Cleveland. I'm sorry. President Grover Cleveland was 49 years old when he married the First Lady Frances Folsom in the White House, and she was 21 years old. So you can see that this kind of shenanigans, may not have been that uncommon. The funny story about that wedding was about John Philip Sousa, the very famous director,
Yep.
band director. He led the Marine Corps band at the wedding, and the song that they chose to play when the president danced with the new First Lady was from the operetta The Mikado, and the name of the song was "Oh, He's Going to Marry Yum Yum."
He's going to marry what?
Yum
Now?
Yum.
Okay. Yeah,
Yum Yum. He's going to marry Yum Yum.
And that was what Sousa wanted to play during the wedding. I've got to ask you this. So we are with Kennedy in mind. Unfortunately, we did have two presidents assassinated. We had Kennedy and Lincoln. Did the White House change at all after these assassinations, policy-wise, security-wise? Like, how did those two really change the culture in the White House?
Well, let's go back to a story I told a little while ago. Elvis Presley was able to bring a gun in the White House. So, far as security was concerned, I think it happened at least after Nixon. What happened to Ronald Reagan, he was almost assassinated.
Right.
And there's actually a funny story about that, too. Not about the shots that were actually taken at Reagan, but during a short time earlier, during the inaugural parade in 1981, Reagan let it be known that he wanted to ride a horse in the parade. And the Secret Service was not really happy with that, obviously, because he would be a prime target for an assassination attempt, sitting out there on a horse in the middle of the street in the inaugural parade. So they kicked this around for a while, and they came up with a plan to have the president wear a steel cowboy hat and bulletproof underwear. And I don't know how they were going to do that, but they chewed this plan over for a while and finally dropped the idea and talked Reagan out of riding the horse in the parade.
Well, that was smart. I know there was a lot of worry when Trump was walking around on Inauguration Day. Thank God nothing happened to him, but at that time, a lot of people were worried that he was going to walk, but he was pretty secure there. So that was interesting to see him walk out amongst the people with security, of course. That was good. Okay, so this has been great, and I've got to ask you one more thing. Which president was too fat for the White House bathtub? And if you don't say it was Taft, I'm going to say, all right, well, who was it?
No, it was Taft. And he weighed 340 pounds, and he could not fit into the White House tub. So they had to install a new king-size tub for him. And there was another funny story about Taft. He actually was the first president who owned a car. And he liked to take the car out and drive it around Washington. And the other car owners in Washington found out about this. So they would drive out and drive around with Taft. So it got to be kind of a race. And they would drive around the tidal basin in Washington. And it came to be known as the Speedway, as Taft was racing these other guys in his car. Can you imagine that happening today? I don't think so.
No, I can't. So the book is called Painting the White House by Hal Marcovitz. Now, I see here you've done more nonfiction books for young readers on topics like fake news, media bias. Tell us about that. That's interesting. What have you been writing about, seeing your perspective as a journalist and the news cycle we're seeing today?
Well, I started kind of moonlighting several years ago, writing books, nonfiction books, for the school library market for a number of publishers. And the publishers, have these nonfiction type topics that would be covered by a teacher in class, and they could be all over the spectrum. I've written about history topics like, the cause of World War II, how was the atom bomb invented, all sorts of things, to health topics like dangerous drugs, mental health topics, social issues like drug abuse, alcohol abuse. You mentioned fake news. I did write a book about how the news media is judged and what constitutes fake news. So, that's taken up a lot of my time. I did lead newspaper work a few years ago, and this is pretty much what I do now. And write funny novels, too.
Well, obviously, with this painter, it's kind of interesting. But really quickly, as a journalist, what does constitute that fake news aspect to you as someone who's been in the field?
When I was a journalist, I was a print reporter. I worked for newspapers. There was nothing fake about what we did. We went out and gathered the facts and told the story objectively, telling the people, the readers, what was going on. And this whole notion of fake news, the news has become very, how can I say, compartmentalized. Cable television, the internet, whatever, picks and chooses what they want to tell their specific, listeners, their readers. And that's, I think, how this whole notion of fake news kind of evolved, that you're only cherry picking the facts that you want to tell, and you're not getting both sides of the story. And in the glorious days of print journalism, we didn't do that. We told both sides of the story. So,
well, has it inspired you to get back into journalism?
That sheds some light on it.
Has it inspired you to get back into it to tell both sides of stories that you feel should be told?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Have you felt inspired, Hal Marcovitz, to get back into journalism, knowing that this is such a crazy news, one-sided situation?
I wouldn't know how to do it. As I said, I was a newspaper journalist, and it's very hard to get back into newspaper work now. There's a lot fewer papers than there were when I was doing it. I wouldn't know how to even find a job in print journalism now. It's a very sad state of affairs that the print news, which is basically the best news you can find, the news that you can trust, is just falling by the wayside. I'm very sorry.
Well, and we will hope for better days there. Where can people get the book, and where can they find you with all these intriguing stories? Are you on Twitter, or what's the best way to reach you?
The best way is to go to the website, paintingthewhitehouse.com.
All right.
You'll see information about the book and how to get it and how to order it. And you'll find some funny White House stories there and an excerpt from the book.
And I almost forgot to tell you.
Whatever you needed to know.
I almost forgot to ask you the $1 million question. Have you yourself ever been in the White House?
I was, I believe, with the Boy Scouts.
Okay.
Back in the 60s. And I'm not sure how much it's changed since then.
Huh. That's very interesting. Well, thank you for sharing all this today, Hal. And we will definitely visit paintingthewhitehouse.com. Pretty straightforward. And Hal, would love to have you back as things keep on rolling here.
Oh, I'd be delighted to talk with you again. There are many, many, many more funny stories about the White House. And we haven't even scratched the surface.
And maybe we can make this more topical, like election time. Hey, any election stories? Yada, yada, yada. We'll figure that out, Hal. But thanks for joining us tonight.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
You got it. I'm Alexander Garrett. Enjoy your Sunday afternoon. Hal, this was